A leitura do livro The New Map, de Daniel Yergin. Esse livro está em inglês e trata sobre um panorama sobre o mercado de energia e preservação do meio ambiente no mundo, com algumas opiniões, histórico. Então vamos lá. Então nesse caso o texto está realmente na língua original, em inglês. Introduction. This book is about the new global map that is being shaped by dramatic shifts in the geopolitics and energy. It is also about where this map is taking us. Geopolitics focuses on the shifting balance and rising tensions among nations. Energy reflects far-reaching alterations in global supply and flows, driven in major part by the remarkable change in the energy position of the United States and by the growing global role of renewables and the new politics of climate. Different kinds of power are in play. One is the power of nations that is shaped by economics, military capabilities, and geography, by grand strategy and calculated ambitions, by suspicion and fear, and by the contingent and the unexpected. The other is the power that comes from oil and gas and coal, from wind and solar, and from splitting atoms, and the power that comes from policies that seek to reorder the world's energy system and to move forward net zero carbon in the name of climate. This is no simple map to follow, for it is dynamic, constantly changing. It has been made even more complicated by the coronavirus virus that swept out of China and across the planet in 2020, bringing grief and vast human suffering and disarray. It also shut down the world economy, disrupted commerce, both local and global, destroyed jobs and businesses, and impoverished many, plunged the world economy into the deepest recession since the Great Depression, added enormously to public debt, accentuated the tensions among countries, and created vast turmoil in global energy markets. This book seeks to illuminate and explain this new map, how the shale revolution has changed America's position in the world, how and why new Cold Wars are developing between the United States on one hand and Russia and China on the other, and energy's role in them. How swiftly and potentially perilously the overall relationship between the United States and China is changing from engagement to strategic rivalry. And what begins to look like an emerging Cold War. How unsteady are the foundations of the Middle East that still supplies a third of the world's total petroleum and a significant amount of natural gas. How the familiar ecosystem of oil and autos, which has held for more than a century, is now being challenged by a new mobility revolution. How climate concerns are reshaping the map of energy, and how the much discussed energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables may actually play out, and how has the coronavirus changed the energy markets and the future roles of the big three, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, which now dominate world oil. America's new map tells the story of the unanticipated shale revolution that is transforming America's place in the world, upending world's energy markets and resetting global geopolitics. Together, shale oil and shale gas have proven to be the biggest energy innovations so far in the 21st century. Wind and solar are both innovations of the 70s and 80s, though they came into their own only over the last decade. The United States has surged ahead of Russia and Saudi Arabia to become the world's number one producer of both oil and gas, and is now one of the world major exporters of both. Though targeted for bans by some politicians, the shale revolution has fueled America's economic growth, enhancing its trade position, generating investments and job creation, and lowering utility bills for millions of consumers. The supply chains supporting shale reach all across the United States, into virtually every state, creating jobs, even in the New York State, which prohibits shale development within its borders, owing to environmental opposition. Starting with the energy crisis in the 70s, Americans became accustomed to thinking the country was vulnerable because of U.S. dependence on imported sources. But the geopolitical consequences for the United States, now that is almost self-sufficient, are apparent in the new dimension of influence, increased energy security, and greater flexibility in foreign policy. Yet there are limits to this newfound self-assurance, for energy remains a globally interconnected industry, and these consequences are still only part of the overall nexus of relations among nations. Moreover, shale was already in search of its next revolution when coronavirus sent it spinning into a new crisis. Russia's map is about the tinder created by the interaction of energy flows, geopolitical competition, and the continuing contention over the unsettled borders that resulted from the collapse of the Soviet Union 3 decades ago, and from Vladimir Putin's drive to restore Russia as a great power. Russia may be an energy superpower, but it is also economically dependent on oil and gas exports. Today, as in Soviet times, those exports are stoking fierce debate about the possible political leverage over Europe that may come in their wake. Yet, any potential leverage has been dissipated by changes in both the European and global gas markets. The consequences of the abrupt transformation of the Soviet Union into 15 independent countries remain uncertain. Nowhere more so than between Russia and Ukraine, where conflict over natural gas has been central. Following the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, the struggle moved to the battlefield in southeastern Ukraine. In the strange way that history works, that war, and specifically the matter of US weapons to resist Russian tanks, triggered the impeachment of Donald Trump by the House of Representatives, followed by his acquittal by the Senate. US-Russian relations have sunk to a level of hostility not seen since Soviet days in the early 80s. At the same time, Russia has returned to the Middle East and is pivoting to the East, to China. Moscow and Beijing are united in asserting absolute sovereignty and their opposition to what they decry as American hegemony. There are also practical considerations to their burgeoning relationship. China needs energy, and Russia needs markets. China's map is rooted both in what is called the century of humiliation and in its tremendous gains in the global economic and military power over the last 2 decades, and by the energy needs of what will become the world's largest economy and by some measure already is. China is expanding its reach in all dimensions, geographically, militarily, economically, technologically, and politically. The workshop of the world. It now seeks to move up the value chain and become the global leader in the new industries of the century. China is also asserting its own map for almost the entirety of the South China Sea, the most critically oceanic trade route in the world, and now the sharpest point of strategic confrontation with the United States. Energy is an important part of that claim. China's Belt and Road Initiative is designed to redraw the economic map of Asia and Eurasia and beyond, putting what was once the Middle Kingdom in the middle of the reordered global economy. The initiative seeks to assure that China will have markets for its goods and access to the energy and raw materials that it needs. But to what degree is the Belt and Road mainly an economic project, or, as critics assert, a geopolitical project aimed at creating a new Chinese order in world politics? The WTO consensus that goes back to the beginning of the century has broken down. Criticisms of China is one thing that unites divided Democrats and Republicans in the United States and the national security establishments in both countries increasingly focus on the other as the future adversary. Yet the two countries are more integrated economically and more interdependent than many recognize, as the 2020 coronavirus outbreak unhappily demonstrated, and they are mutually dependent on global prosperity. But that reality counts for less as calls grow louder for decoupling between the world's two largest economies, accompanied by growing mistrust, which has been amplified by the coronavirus crisis. One has been one of the lasting consequences of which will be greater tension between the two countries. The Middle East geographic boundaries were continually redrawn throughout antiquity, with the rise and fall of so many empires. Though the Ottoman Turkish Empire ruled for 6 centuries, its borders were often shifting. The map of the modern Middle East was laid down during and after the First World War, in the vacuum resulting from the collapse of the Ottomans, and yet based on the provincial lines left behind by the Ottomans. The maps have been challenged ever since by pan-Arab nationalism and political Islam, by opposition to the State of Israel, and then by jihadists such as ISIS, who wants to replace the very idea of a nation-state with a caliphate. One of the biggest challenges in the region today comes from the rivalry between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran for preeminence, now made more complex by Turkey's new bid for that role, reclaiming a lineage going back to the Ottomans. But also defining for the region are the 4-decade confrontation between the United States and Iran, and the prevalence of weak governance in many countries. The Middle East has been shaped, of course, not only by the maps of frontiers, but by different kinds of maps, of geology, the oil and gas wells, of pipelines and tanker routes. The oil and gas and the revenues and riches and power that flow from them remain central to the identity of the region. Yet the oil price collapse that began in 2014 has fed into a new debate about the future of oil. Not much more than a decade ago, the world worried about peak oil, the idea that oil supplies would run out. The focus has shifted to peak demand. How long consumption of oil will continue to grow and when it will begin to decline? Will oil lose its value and importance in the decades to come? The demand collapse for oil in 2020 has further fueled the urgency for oil exporters to diversify and modernize their economies, which Abu Dhabi had begun in 2007 with its Vision 2030, and which Saudi Arabia is now trying to do in double time. If there is one major factor leading to the idea that demand, not supply, is its future constraints, it is related to the junction of climate policies and technology. The one market that seemed to be guaranteed for oil for a very long time was transportation, and specifically the automobile. No longer, not on the roadmap to the future. For oil now faces a sudden challenge from the new triad, the electric car, which uses no oil. Mobility as a service, ride-hailing and ride-sharing, and cars that drive themselves. The result could be a contest for dominance in a new trillion-dollar industry, autotech. The debate over how rapidly the world can and must adjust to a changing climate and how much it will cost, it is unlikely to be resolved in this decade. But the endeavor will take on greater urgency as public opinion becomes more aroused and new policies seek to implement net zero carbon. All this takes us to the energy transition, the shift from the world of today, which depends on oil, natural gas, and coal for more than 80% of its energy, just as it did 30 years ago, to a world that increasingly operates on renewables. The Paris Agreement of 2015 galvanized the march towards a lower carbon future. Indeed, in terms of energy climate, and there are two distinct eras, before Paris and after Paris. Yet, while energy transition has become a pervasive theme all around the world, disagreements rage, both within countries and among them, on the nature of transition, how it unfolds, how long it takes, and who pays energy transition certainly means something that very different to the developing countries such as India, where hundreds of millions of impoverished people do not have access to commercial energy, than to Germany or the Netherlands. Solar and wind have become the chosen vehicles for decarbonizing electricity. Once alternatives, they are now mainstreams. Yet, as their share of generation grows larger, they confront the challenge of intermittency. They can flood the grid with electricity when the sun shines and the wind blows, but then almost disappear when the day is cloudy or there is only a murmuring breeze. This points to major technological challenges to maintain grid stability and find ways to store electricity at large scale for periods longer than a few hours. Climate will be a profound determinant of the new map of energy. Here I build on the story I began in the quest. In that book, I explored how climate went from being a subject of interest to a handful of scientists in mid-19th century Europe who feared the advent of another ice age that would obliterate civilization, to the consensus about warming that would bring 195 countries together in Paris in 2015 to forge a climate compact that has become the global benchmark. The focus in the pages of this book is on how the momentum of climate policies powered by research and observation, by climate models, and by political mobilization and regulatory power, social activism, financial institutions, and deepening anxiety, will transform the energy system. Net zero carbon will be one of the great challenges of the decades ahead, not just politically, but also in how people live their lives and in the cost of achieving it. My first book, Shattered Peace, is about the origins of the Soviet-American Cold War. Now, in these pages, you will find the origins of the new Cold Wars. The prize is a sprawling canvas about geopolitics and oil over almost a century and a half, and that certainly is part of the narrative of the new map. The Commanding Heights, which I co-authored, was about the world after the Cold War and the new age of globalization. Now, the fragmenting of globalization becomes part of this story, for the coronavirus has fueled a retreat that has already begun from globalization and from the international institutions and cooperation that have underpinned it. In 2008-2009, international collaboration was key to conquering the financial contagion. A dozen years later, such cooperation at the governmental and international level in fighting the contagion of the virus was notable by its absence. What had been talk of decoupling had turned into a rolling back of the supply chain that have been a foundation of the 90 trillion global economy. More broadly, borders go up, nationalism and protectionism rise, and the generally free movements of people become less free. One consequence of the global economic misery from the pandemic of 2020 could be greater prevalence of fragile and failed states, which would create new security challenges that, at some point, would reach beyond their borders. Yet governments would be hampered in responding to domestic and international needs, whether around security or health or energy and climate, by the huge debt and fiscal armor they have assumed in battling to preserve their economies. But the journey on the road to the future had commenced well before the coronavirus crisis, not only with renewables and electric vehicles, but also with a shale revolution that has transformed the energy position of the United States, shaken global markets, and changed America's role in the world. And it is on that road where we will now begin. Continuo no próximo vídeo.